Thank you for that, Steve. Well, it's nice to be here where you folks have rain. It's been dry out on the Great Plains. We're not right next to Texas, but we're close enough. Too close. I won't editorialize yet. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. And I've been here before. Some, I don't know, 15 years ago and 10 years ago and drive through and so on. So I'm not a stranger. And you folks aren't strangers either. Let's hope. I've been thinking about this talk quite a bit. And I had a talk at noon today. And you sure don't want to have to repeat yourself. And so I'm going to do my best not to. I thought I'd tell you a little bit what set me off in 1977. I'd been reading that General Accounting Office study on the efficacy of the soil erosion, or Soil Conservation Service. And the way I read it, it looked to me like soil erosion was as bad in 1977 as when the Soil Conservation Service was formed in the mid-30s. It was called the Soil Erosion Service then, and it was under Roosevelt. And Hugh Hammond Bennett was an energetic and imaginative sort of guy, and Roosevelt made him the founding chief of the service. And I thought, you know, here's something that thousands of miles of terraces, grass waterways. Wellington Brink had said, no organization's been put together with more esprit de corps devoted to the common task of saving our soils, all the way from the stenographers to the PhDs in soil science. I read somewhere once, I've not been able to find it since, but I don't doubt it, that 1/7 of the total federal budget was devoted to soil and water conservation. Now that's back during the CCC days, so it's easy to imagine that being that chunk of the budget. And so when I saw that GAO study, I thought, you know, something's wrong here. Back in those days, I had interns, and we had a trip, made a trip to the Konza Prairie, which is just 60 miles along I-70 up the road from Salina. And Lloyd Hulbert, who was the ecologist, really good grassland ecologist, gave us a wonderful field trip that day. And as I was sitting there listening to the students ask Lloyd questions and looking at that prairie, and with the General Accounting Office study in mind, you know, here was this prairie that was running on contemporary sunlight. It was featuring material recycling. It didn't experience an epidemic, fixed its own nitrogen, and, you know, you can see right down the road corn and sorghum and sunflowers and wheat and so on, all dependent upon the extractive economy with fossil fuels, putting chemicals out there that our tissues have no evolutionary experience with, and soil erosion. And so that's sort of what set me off, thinking, is it possible to build an agriculture based on the way that prairie works? Well, so I wrote a paper in 78, and I said, you know, I think we can do it. This is after I'd called around to some of my buddies that were geneticists and ecologists, and, you know, I got the usual response I get from my friends. Look, Wes, you're crazy, but now this is completely nuts. Everybody knows that you can't get perennialism and high seed yield to go together. Don't you know about the R and K selection formula and the trade-off theory and this, that, and the other? And I have to tell you, it keeps you awake at night, wondering if maybe this just is crazy. Anyway, somehow or another, we persevered, and I published a book called New Roots for Agriculture. It came out in 1980, and I got a phone call. Actually, I got a letter from Wendell Berry pleading with me to change my mind about tractors running on biofuels and instead include horses. I had at the last chapter there, outside the Solar Village, a Sunshine Farm. And so I wrote him back, thanked him for his critique, and, you know, when Wendell said anything in those days, I was prepared to cave in and do just exactly what he wanted me to do. And so I included horses the next time. But he was so pleased with my accommodation of his critique that he called me up, and he came out, and we got to be friends, and been friends ever since. But then we built a greenhouse, and so I invited Wendell to come and dedicate that greenhouse, and he gave one of the most useful talks that I've ever heard. And the talk had to do with the history of humans looking to nature as a standard or measure. And so Wendell went right back in the literary tradition to, Job. And in fact, I'm going to read just a little about what Wendell said. I think it's on... Yeah, here it is. He said, he began by quoting Job. Here's what Job said. Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Well, after Job, then Virgil, a little over 2,000 years ago. And this is at the beginning of the Georgics. This is 36 to 29 BC. Virgil instructs us that before we plow an unfamiliar patch, it is well to be informed about the winds, about the variations in the sky, the native traits and habits of the place, what each locale permits and what denies. Well, then Wendell jumped forward to the end of the 16th century with Edmund Spenser, who called nature the equal mother of all creatures, who knittest each to each as brother unto brother. And Spenser also saw nature as the instructor of creatures and the ultimate earthly judge of their behaviors. Well, Wendell continued in that vein, and included in it, he mentioned Shakespeare in As You Like It. You'll remember in Shakespeare, he has the forest judge. It's in the role of a teacher and a judge. And then Milton in Comus has the lady say of nature, she, good cateress, means her provision only to the good, that liveth according to her sober laws, and holy dictate of spare temperance. And finally, Alexander Pope, in his epistle to Burlington, counseled gardeners to, quote, let nature never be forgot, consult the genius of the place in all. Well, Wendell says an interesting thing then. It's been most useful. He says the Romantic poets after that used, the British English poets, used nature only as a reservoir of symbols, not having any practical value. Just a kind of way of showing off their literary stuff, I guess. Don't say, Wendell didn't say that, I'm saying that. So and then this is the most interesting point. Wendell says after Pope, Alexander Pope, the idea of nature having practical value goes underground in the formal culture. And when it pops up again, it's among scientists. Liberty Hyde Bailey in The Holy Earth, Sir Albert Howard, and also he has, well, J. Russell Smith. Then here's, I think, really just the brilliant insight. He says, in the formal culture, the idea of nature having practical value for us comes as a series, but it comes as a succession in the common culture. Now, it takes a little while to digest that. In the common culture, it's running along like a stream, always there. But it doesn't pop up in the formal culture among the literary people or the scientists except in a series. Boop, 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 boop. Y'all got that? All right, so after these different folk that have been creating the series, one would think that with Hugh Hammond Bennett and the Soil Conservation Service, that finally we have it institutionalized that nature is the measure, because Bennett said time and again, we always look to nature. We ask nature. He says that in just one speech after another. And so what's going wrong here? If we still have these problems, here was our opportunity for the formal culture to have it from now on. But in my view, no. Now, I want to shift gears here just a little bit and give you an illustration of what I mean by consulting the genius of the place in all. Back in the 1930s, in the Great Plains, there's the famous Dust Bowl. And there is a lot of studies that were done during that time. I'm going to pick a particular graduate student at the University of Nebraska that was working on a master's degree. His last name is Noll, N-O-L-L. He was working with the famous Weaver of the Weaver and Clements, that Clementsian ecology that some of you will know about. And Noll, it happened to be the driest year on record, I think maybe 1932. And he was out to look at the precipitation and what was happening to the vegetation, and he compared a never plowed native prairie to an adjacent wheat field, and measured everything from temperatures at various heights, depths, how much water there was, and so on. Well, all the wheat plants died, but the prairie came back. The local genius of that place is the prairie. Now, it has to do with a water management system. Now go with me to a tropical rainforest. There, water is a nemesis to fertility because of the leaching downward. Takes the nutrients below. So the forest is designed, is evolved to receive the water and get rid of it fast. There's the local genius there. So when Pope says, consult the genius of the place and all. Now, Pope was a gardener, and actually that poem had a great effect on from thereafter on English gardening. In fact, a gardener could be fired on the spot if he or she had not consulted the local genius. Read that poem. It's a very long poem, but don't read it all. Just read what... It's a complicated poem. You want somebody that'll sit down and flunk you if you don't get it. So I mean, for me, it was a difficult poem. So So here we have a world, and as I mentioned at the talk at noon, that 10,000 years ago, essentially all of nature's land-based ecosystems, I'm talking about the ice-free land of the planet, feature perennials grown in mixtures, essentially all. There are plenty of examples around that represent the exception. And when we started agriculture with the wheat plant, first of all at the eastern end of the Mediterranean where it's drying out with the retreat of the ice, the Pleistocene ice, that's where the wheat plant was found probably in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, and that's the beginning of annual till agriculture, which means that if you're going to get your seed to germinate, you got to destroy the vegetation at the surface, and there's the beginning of the idea that nature is to be subdued or ignored. So it's interesting to think how this idea of looking to nature manages to persist when, well, now 70% of our calories and some 70% of our agricultural acreage is devoted to annual grains, the grasses and the legumes. Humans are primarily grass seed eaters and secondarily legume seed eaters. But this idea has persisted. So what I think we need to do is to solve the 10,000-year-old problem of agriculture, and we can do it now. We can do it now, especially now, because of the computational power that's available, because of some of the techniques that have been developed that allow us to have molecular markers. We're not doing GMOs. We start with the idea that perennialism is a way of life. There's no gene for perennialism. You don't just find the gene for perennial and park it in. It's spread across the genome. It's a way of being. And so mostly it's just breeding that we're talking about. So I'm going to show you some slides, and then I'm going to say some more. We're in near Salina, Kansas. We have about 630 acres, and we have over 100 acres of prairie that's never been plowed. We just, at the end of this month, will close on a 37-acre prairie that is the westernmost tallgrass prairie that is bottomland prairie. And so we look at the prairie as the standard or measure, and so we take a lot of data there to learn about the dynamics and then hope to mimic enough of that structure. So that's the Land Institute, and we're 31 people work there in the summertime, 39 or 40, and we have an awful lot of fun. Now, my kids are all grown and married and have children of their own and are able to get even for me. The children are. They sometimes at the meal table they would say, well, Dad, explain that. Maybe this time don't go back to the Big Bang. That's one of their lines. Another one is, and so, Dr. Doom, what can we as ordinary citizens do about this problem? But I'm going to go this side of the Big Bang. Because I think it's important for us to get a context of what's put us in this particular position, and I call it the 3.45 billion year imperative. The fact that we are biotic, that all organisms are carbon-based. And so we go after energy-rich carbon, or we create it. And we've been doing that for 3.45 billion years. So, but then some 10 to 11,000 years ago, we started getting the young pulverized coal of the soil with annual till agriculture. And that is what started civilization. I also think that's when global warming began, climate change began. And then we got the forest in order to sponsor the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And I recommend, if you haven't read lately, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and how Enkidu and Gilgamesh went out to kill the giant of the forest. And then after he was killed, why then they, they set the woodcutters loose. And so that's their mythology. But you could say there's probably a bump in population when we got into the forest. So that was the eastern end of the Mediterranean. We know that was going on the time of Solomon. He struck a deal with the king of Tyre to buy the cedars of Lebanon to build the temple. So the cutting of the forest just continued, and by the time of Charlemagne, an enlightened ruler, the onslaught of the forest was well underway. So we just been going, and some of that forest land then became cropland, and then the erosion, of course, continued. Well, then the third pool of carbon is the coal, 250 years ago, and then natural gas had been around. Goes all the way back to the oracle at Delphi, that flame, that oracle that always spoke with a kind of ambiguity, telling Croesus, if you make war against the Persians, a great kingdom will fall. And Croesus made war against the Persians, a great kingdom fell, his. He wasn't like the Hebrew prophets. They'd say, if you do this, you're going to get that. The Greeks had a different way of they were more like modern politicians. And then the oil of 1859, and not long after that, natural gas started being used for power. So those 5 pools of energy-rich carbon, because of, in my view, the 3.45 billion year imperative. We've not practiced restraint. So this is the context of us. So I see agriculture as where it all began. And you'll see, I hope, by the end, that I think that's where the correction must begin. Because, as my friend Chuck Washburn said, the late Chuck Washburn said, if we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. We've got to go right back to that. So I like to show this slide to remind people. This is Bruegel's 1565, The Harvesters. I like it partly because I always wonder, are those people short or is the wheat tall? And it's probably both. But you see there apple and pear trees, and they're limbed up to let the light in. And look at the percent of that landscape that is devoted to the grain, the percent of the ag landscape. This is just to emphasize that we're primarily grass seed eaters. Now, it's amazing when we think of it, how this scene here was not too different from a similar scene that we could have had in the early 1900s. But somewhere after World War II, things began to change. Here you can see the rising of the pesticide industry. Rachel Carson, 1962, the pesticide industry has doubled and doubled again in the interest of us getting energy-rich carbon. It's sort of like bacteria on a petri dish. If there's sugar there, they just go for it. So, and here is nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. The nitrogen is the blue, red is water, and the green is the phosphorus, going back again to about 1948. So here are these slopes. After World War II, we really changed the world and industrialized societies. I mean, I'm 75 now, and it's amazing when I consider that in my lifetime, 99% of all the oil ever burned has been burned. The 10-year-old has lived through a quarter of all the oil ever burned. The 22-year-old, 54% of all the oil ever burned. So the speed that this is coming on, it's like a lot of curves that start out rather slowly and then build. And of course, here's the diesel tank. I mean, the farm I was born on had horses. We had horses. I remember when we got the tractors. And then, of course, the most important invention of the 20th century. In 1909, two Germans, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, learned how to take nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, and turn it into ammonia. It takes anywhere from half to twice as many fossil fuel calories to sponsor nitrogen fertility in America's fields as we use for traction. So it takes, you know, something like 350 atmospheres and 400 degrees C in order to have this nitrogen available for our fields. So once again, we go after the energy-rich carbon because, as I say, natural gas is the feedstock. Well, what do we do with it? Here is what was, until soybeans became an important crop, the #1 killer of the planet, of the continent, corn. This is in Illinois. It went in 1 year from 70 million bushels an acre to 90 million bushels an acre. I feel another digression coming on. I got to say this. 26 gallons of gasoline has the same number of calories that the average American eats in a year. Let's say we don't eat for a year and turn all of our food into ethanol. That's 2 gallons a month a person. And let's say we take all the corn stalks and all the peanut shells and all the grass clippings and wheat straw and so on and turn that into ethanol. Maybe another 2 gallons. And stop all exports, depends on how you calculate it, another 1.5 to 2 gallons. And a huge subsidy, right around $6 billion this year. We go after energy-rich carbon, and we'll do it at the cost of energy-rich carbon. That's how nutty we can be as a result of the 3.45 billion year imperative. So there is more than that. There is this, which is really, I think, the #1 killer now. Both of those systems leak nitrogen. They're only about anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the nitrogen is taken up. The rest through the system. And if you look at a satellite photo in the upper Midwest, this is Iowa and Minnesota, and Nebraska's in there. Well, Minnesota's at the top in the middle. You know, Nebraska. You folks know your states. All right, good. I thought maybe over here you didn't care whether we even had anything the other side of the mountain. Everything's so wonderful. I mean, what do we have this Oregon Trail for in the first place anyway? I mean, it makes a person wonder, you know. Well, look at that. Imagine now that the Gulf of Mexico is south of there. And that's the rains come about the time you're preparing the fields for corn and soybeans. this is not an uncommon picture. Somebody asked me what I would do if I had a bunch of heads of foundations, what I would do in order to convince them. I'd put them on a bus and drive them through Iowa and Illinois and Indiana in April and May and make them hang their head out the window without any cell phones. Now we have minimum till, no till. And that's supposed to stop the soil erosion. Yes, so here's clear water coming off a minimum till, no till. And the milky water is from a conventional field. Looks pretty good, except you take a sample of that water out of that tube. And this, by the way, came from a minimum till, no till researcher at, well, I think he's at Pullman now, but it's twice the acceptable EPA level for nitrogen coming out of that tube. Annual systems leak. And so at the end, you have a dead zone as the result of all that nitrogen coming off. That dead zone's about the size of New Jersey. All right, there's that. Now here's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, UN-sponsored assessment of the state of the planet. There it is. Agriculture is the largest threat to biodiversity and ecosystem function of any single human activity. They're thinking primarily, I think, of the grain agriculture and considering what's going on in Brazil. And this is Chris Field's paper in Science in '01. In most parts of the world, human activities in agriculture in particular have resulted in decreases in net primary productivity from the levels that likely existed prior to human management. Now that's good news for those of us that are looking to the ecosystem and from the point of view of breeders that are involved in reallocation of photosynthate. So, if we imagine the world before agriculture, featuring perennial mixtures almost everywhere on land, whether it's a rainforest or desert scrub, or here is one of our typical prairies of Kansas. This is the Flint Hills of Kansas. This has never been plowed. Tens of thousands of acres that actually anywhere from 2.2 to 2.4 pounds will be put on a steer in the summertime per day on these warm season grasses: big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, blue grama, hairy grama, so on. Very nutritious. It doesn't erode beyond replacement levels, natural replacement levels. So that's our standard. So what we're about at the land mostly is we're mostly plant breeders with some ecology. We'll be adding ecologists. We've had ecologists and we'll be adding them. So for instance, we cross the annual wheat on the left with a perennial relative on the right, and we get a hybrid. And we, in the greenhouse, we, of course you have to emasculate, clip the anthers with tiny little scissors and make the crosses. All the crosses with the wheats are done in the greenhouse. Sometimes you will, a lot of times, in some of these wide crosses, you'll get the embryo to form, but you won't have the endosperm form. And so we rescue the embryo. The Land Institute's big on embryo rescue. We're pro-life at the Land Institute. We rescue more embryos in the state of Kansas than anybody. But you can see here some of these crosses after harvest, well, you get some shoots coming up. So we say, okay, we've got that's something that's worth paying attention to. Some of them don't make it, though, you can see. One of our plants we call Kernza is a perennial that we're domesticating. And I think maybe I want to show you a photograph. Well, this'll, you doing all right with this? The plant at the top is the wheat plant that started civilization. The one on the bottom is the kind of plant that'll save it. So here, these roots are 10 feet long, and this plant is about 14 months old. So look at it as an investment. Now, there'll be some sloughing, but we, especially with our perennial sorghum, one thing we notice is that the perennial sorghum is up and developing a canopy before the ground's warm enough for the grain of the annual to germinate. So you got a canopy longer. So you folks can come up and pet this later. So you can imagine the elegant micromanagement of nutrients and water. You can also imagine, I just can't resist. You can also imagine, yeah, let's do this again. You can also imagine when we came across the continent and hit the grasslands, after cutting the forests and plowing the prairies, where we cut it off, and all that's carbon now, that had to have contributed significantly to climate change. That's a lot of carbon. Marty Bender, the late Marty Bender, who was with us for many years, I walked in one day to Marty and said, Marty, let's pretend it's October 1492. And typical Marty response was, what the hell you want to do that for? And I said, let's get an estimate of the amount of carbon in the biota on the day before Columbus. And if that were to be replaced through the revegetation, how many years of oil burning by the U.S. could be absorbed by the vegetation? Now, you all got the picture, or you want me to run it by again? Just put your hand up if you want me to do it again. Good. I like to deal with honest people. All right. When Columbus came, it's been estimated that our soils were about 6% carbon. We cut the forests, we plowed the prairies. As we plowed the prairies, why, of course, this carbon, it's got oxidized off CO2. So let's pretend that we're going to get it back like it was. Now, we've been burning like, around 22 million barrels of oil a day now. Back in 1980, it was only 16 million barrels of oil a day. But I think Marty, I asked him this maybe in 2000, I can't remember. So I said, Marty, if we were to get all it back, how many years worth of burning of oil by the U.S. could our landscape absorb? So he went to work and estimated somewhere between 17 and 30 years. And we sort of settled closer to 17 than 30, so we said 20 years worth of sequestration possible. Now you all have it? Yeah. Good. I'm a pretty good teacher if I get take 2 cracks at it, So just to give you something I'm sort of repeating here now, but imagine the wheat plant being planted in September while this other plant is already there, and then December it gets a little bigger, and March a little bigger, and time it's ready for harvest, why there it is. So, this is just obvious. Now, we've done some work with perennial corn. That's going to take a lot of work, and it's probably going to take, there's some people at Cornell that are working on perennial corn. One of them's pretty optimistic about having it farmer ready in a fairly short period of time. Sorghum, we've crossed sorghum, and we now have winter hardy sorghum that's growing. It's still got a lot of breeding to do in order to shorten it. David Van Tassel started out as a molecular biologist, has become a plant breeder. He's working with the sunflowers, and Maximilian sunflower, he's managed actually to get the single head just through selection on Maximilian sunflower. And then another plant, Silpium, that we've worked with for some time, is also an important oilseed crop. We're also supporting the perennialization of the upland rice in China. A couple of our guys go over there every year looking at that situation. The Chinese are getting very interested in perennials generally. The reason is this upland rice grown on steep slopes, they destroy the vegetation. You maybe get a crop for 2 years, but then that's it. And it's not just there where it's happening, it's in Malaysia. So this is a very serious kind of problem. And by the way, this is a kind of an old slide. Both of those, well, the blue one would be clear at the top there at the right now, but this is just to show that the seed weight is going up, and the response to selection for just seed yield is very high. And you folks know the story. In the beginning, God created the normal distribution, the bell-shaped curve. And so, as a consequence, you just select the tail, large size, and you shift the, you can get big seed if you got enough genetic variation. And here I'll show you just an increase in the stem length that's bearing seeds. And by the way, there's going to be another boost in yield increase. You folks, breeders, know this. Annuals tend to self, that is, take their own, accept their own pollen. And as a consequence, their genetic load doesn't build up much. Perennials tend to be outcrossers. So by outcrossing, that is, then consequently the genetic load can build up because it's being covered by, say, a normal gene. So as we start making doing this inbreeding, what we do is we're noticing that only about half of the places on the spike that would be accommodating a seed actually have seed. What we're doing is getting rid of the genetic load. So the curve goes something like this, and then once you get rid of that genetic load, then it's going to go back up. So, yea, though we go through the valley of the shadow of death, we fear no evil, for the evolutionary force is with us. If you're Methodist, you know things like that. Well, they'll show you about some seed size changes. And this is just some of the molecular markers in wheat. I shouldn't have that in there. But, well, I don't mind having it in there, but it's boring. Of almost 2,000 plants, 43% survived in the summer of 2010, and these are some of them that survived. And in some of our germplasm is now in Australia. Some of the plots in New South Wales. This shows the survivability. And in Nepal, and at the Yunnan Academy of Agricultural Sciences with the perennial rice. Now, here I'll show you the, okay, this is the grain yield, grams per plot. Dehulled grain, and so and over here is spring emergent shoots, the number of shoots per 3 meters. So here is the wild perennial with a lot of shoots hold your fire, folks. It's Johnson grass, Sorghum halepense. All right, here it is here. Here is the annual grain sorghum, or no, the grain sorghum hybrid, and then the grain sorghum inbred. But over here is a sorghum times the perennial, the annual sorghum. So we have an outlier here. And, well, of course, here is an outlier, but it doesn't have the kind of yield. So we got good yield, and we also have the perenniating tissue. And here's an example of David Van Tassel's work to get the single head, increased apical dominance in the sunflower. There is the wild type situation over here out of Maximilian. And it's interesting, it's been interesting to see how easy it is to select for that. Apparently the Native Americans domesticated the sunflower twice, once in the southeastern United States and once in Mexico. So I've been told. All right, so that's the background. And so we felt confident enough that we could start reaching out. Bob Kerrey, the former governor of Nebraska and senator from Nebraska, now he's head of New School in New York City, he was always trying to get me involved in the Farm Bill, the 5-year farm bills. I have any interest in 5-year farm bills. You know, they're all devoted primarily to export policy and so on, and commodities and uninteresting stuff. And I said, we need a 50-year farm bill. And he says, tell you what, we'll do both. We'll do a 5-year farm bill and a 50-year farm bill. Well, I fulfilled my part of the obligation, but he didn't. And so I want to just tell you a little about this 50-year farm bill. 5-year farm bills feature exports, commodities, subsidies, a little on soil conservation, and the food programs. And of course, our 50-year farm bill would protect soil from erosion and so on. You folks can read this. So this is essentially sustaining the resource. Over here is primarily extractive. So we'll go through this kind of slowly. Well, this was done in 2009, and we're talking about 328 million acres. All right, down here we have vegetables and other things I'll show you in a moment. Up here, that black part, those are tree and vine crops. Here is the hay and forage crops. Now, we're not talking about range. We're talking about like alfalfa, crops that are put in rotations. So what we're saying is in 2009, we want the subsidy such that we increase the amount of perennials in the rotation. And the next 5 years more. And then right here, our perennial grains begin to come online, the blue here. And then another 5 years more, and another 5 years more. And at this point, you see where we got those vertical little lines in there? Now we're starting to introduce livestock as management of the perennials. More livestock, more perennial grains, so that we go from 20% perennial to 80% perennial. And we've doubled the amount of tree and vine crops. We've doubled the vegetables over a 50-year period. So we're giving them their due. But the dual purpose, we see fire and grazing as primary management tools. I think more grazing than fire. The selective grazer, the bovine, or the mowing machine, a non-selective grazer. Well, just to show you what we're talking about in that little chunk down here, this little bit here. 66% of that is cotton. 11% of that is market vegetables and melons. 7% sugar beets, 7% processing vegetables, 7% potatoes, 2% tobacco, of this little part here. So I'm saying this to emphasize we got to be talking about the grains. So more livestock fed to pasture, fruit and nut acreage doubled, vegetable acreage doubled, and annual grains replaced with perennial grains. So that's sort of the summary of the story right there. There's more to it in an important ecological sense, that in 1700, the profile looked something like this. The components of agricultural sustainability: permanent vegetation, nitrogen balance, rural community health, chemical health. But then 1862, we all know that's the beginning of the Land Grant College Act. It's also well, you know how that happened. The Homestead Act happened because the Civil War starts in 1861. The South is not coming to Congress. The South opposed giving away land because they knew it would increase the favoritism of the North. And so with them not coming, why we vote in both the Homestead Act and the Land Grant College Act. And then 1883 or so, it's the experiment station, and then 1914's extension. And so just as we start getting everything wired, westward expansion, and we start bringing all this on, look what happens. Things get worse. And then you get soil conservation programs put in the 1930s. You get a little bump. Then you get a corn and soil biofuels boom, and it goes down again. So these little black dots, those represent the 5-year farm bills where we think we can bring back, resurrect. So here's the standard. And here is then something of a summary. When we were hunters and gatherers, we were within the system. We had things that ate on us from the inside. They were called parasites, bacteria, fungi, worms, and so on. And we got eaten from the outside too. Things that like to, we were prey. But then, we start agriculture. And we begin to get out of phase, pretty seriously out of phase. Then we have industrial agriculture, get even more out of phase, but then we put in sustainable agriculture, but it's just a tiny little creep. We're still so heavily dependent upon extraction. So what are we going to do? Well, we're not going back to gathering hunting willfully, or pre-industrial agriculture in the same way, willfully. So we're saying it's possible to have an agriculture that's more isomorphic with the way nature's ecosystems work. So the soil carbon helps make civilization possible. The fossil carbon makes the Bronze and Iron Age possible. Coal makes the Industrial Revolution begin. Oil accelerates it, and so does natural gas. And so what we have then is this line where there's a gradual increase, and then boom, right here at the present is where it really takes off. So, or you can look at it from this point of view. Here is the population curve, and then if you take a similar time frame, why here is the use of oil. So how's that any different than bacteria growing on a petri dish? So what we've done is, as far as population growth, respond to the availability of the non-renewable carbon, and we build an economic system. We got this powerful abstraction ability, and we build an economic system that's nothing more than Petri dish economics. It's capitalism. How we can get to the edge of the dish. Now, every now and then we see, well, it's not fair. We need a little more social justice, so we put in a little regulation so that we can all get to the edge of the Petri dish equally. But it's still growth. And we got to talk about the end of growth. And I want to talk about that just a little bit because I think it might be important. So when economics and population absorb growth through, you can have renewables, and you all know Jevons paradox. William Stanley Jevons, 1865, his book, The Coal Question. He concluded that as industrial England got more efficient, it used more resources, particularly coal and iron. Frees up capital. That's it. So then what? Well, the end of growth. So if we can keep ourselves fed, what do? Well, take measures to preserve the soils and water. And so now here comes the end of my talk, and the most interesting part, and the most exciting part. And if you're not ready for it, why leave? We're going to the foundation world as eco-statesmen and saying, here's what needs done. We can have a sustainable green revolution if we will have a merger of ecology and evolutionary biology with agriculture. And so here's what we're saying to them. Darwin brought about the first major synthesis in biology. Darwin clearly was the most important biologist since Aristotle. It was a great synthesis. Natural history tradition contributed greatly. That's 1859. That's the same year as Drake's oil well. It's also the same year that John Brown was hanged at Harper's Ferry. I won't go into that. That's another lecture. Comes at extra charge. 1859. 1865 is Gregor Mendel. But Mendel was not discovered, his work wasn't discovered until 1900, and then by 3 biologists independently. So genetics had its beginning, and they had to work through on the chromosome theory of heredity. They had to learn about gene interaction. They were mapping genes. They were looking at Drosophila flies and mice and cattle and horses and rats and snapdragons and peas and so on. But as the geneticists were at work, they were developing their own vocabulary. The natural history people, the Darwinian people, did not have an accurate theory of heredity, and so a chasm developed that was pretty deep and wide, and the two were unable to really talk to one another for about 3 decades. But a man who had been raised in the Ukraine in a natural history tradition was at work in Morgan's lab at Columbia on Drosophila flies, and that was Theodosius Dobzhansky. And he began to pull the two together, and in 1936 wrote a book that was published in 1937 entitled Genetics and the Origin of Species. That was a major synthesis. And there was a great flowering that followed Dobzhansky's synthesis, and others developed their own version of the synthesis, not necessarily in competition, but we had a flourishing. That's 37. So 1865 to 1859, then 1937, And then 1953 is Watson and Crick. And so now we have molecular biology that is able to kind of integrate it all. So we're calling that the third synthesis. By the way, this paper that Stan Cox at the Land Institute and an ecologist at Prescott College and I are doing this paper called The Next Synthesis. So now we have the three that have come together, and so the evolutionary biology, ecology with the modern molecular synthesis, we're saying now stands ready to merge with agriculture now that we have the perennials on the horizon. And that'd be the fourth synthesis. So that's what we're saying to the foundation world. We have a chance for the first time in history, and partly because of the computational power, partly because of the molecular tools, partly because of a sense of a great possibility to have a conceptual revolution for agriculture. So what we're saying to the world is there are a lot of places around the planet that we could set up stations. There's people working with rice. There's IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, Yunnan, African Rice Center. So the Philippines, China, Pan-Africa, the wheats, several there, corn, several here, sorghum, several here, pigeon pea, several, other legumes, oilseed crops, soybeans, and so on. We authors are picking 11 sites. Actually, we'll probably add another. There's a very vigorous program at the University of Manitoba on perennials. But what we're saying is we need 11 or 12 sites around the planet. These happen to be our favorite. 5 virtual sites: Cornell, University of Georgia, Washington State, North Carolina State, Texas A&M. And what we do is train 110 PhD scientists. We would have them come in cohorts. Cohort 1 would have 22. The next year we would start cohort 2, then cohort 3, then cohort 4, then cohort 5 for 110 total. So we would pay these people $50,000 a year for 3 years. $30,000 salary, $20,000 for lab or whatever. Breeders, molecular geneticists, ecologists, and modelers. Breeders, 7 in cohort 1. Molecular geneticists, 3. Ecologists and modelers, and so on. The next year, 7, 2, 7, da-da-da. You see? And then, here's what would have happened when this program began. 50 PhD level scientists in these 11 places getting things established to start to be receiving these young PhDs. So, well, here's the cost. Each fellow, $50,000 times 3 years, costs that much. Each major prof gets $10,000 per year for each fellow, this much. Committee members, selecting, travel, $24 million. They then go off and work in clusters in these 11 or 12 places around the planet, and each cluster would have these 10 individuals: the coordinator, a modeler, the breeders, the geneticists, the ecologists, the agronomists, and then technicians, 10 of them, 10 support staff, a total of 30. The annual cost per site, $4.5 million. So here's the summary. You got 50 PhD level scientists for the first 3 years. That's going to cost $45 million. The 5 virtual sites, $22.5. Training the PhDs, $24 million. And then this will be the cost for all 11 clusters for the next 27 years, and so on, a total cost of $1.64 billion. $55 million a year for 30 years. Each cluster is committed to a 30-year time frame. Now, they'll be working alongside others at Summit or wherever that are working on short-term here and now, and there will naturally be leakage between the two, but they're to keep their eye on the 30-year ball and not get distracted into the here and now. Sounds like a lot of money? It's 1/3 the current cost for the ethanol study for subsidy for 1 year. Peanuts. And if we could do that, that would be the most significant possibility. Now, what do we have to help move this along? We've got this broad discipline of ecology and evolutionary biology, where they've been putting knowledge on the shelf for 100 years. We've got 26 long-term ecological research sites around the country. One of them is the Konza Prairie in Kansas. Another is in Puerto Rico. There's one that's agricultural, and that's the Kellogg Station in Michigan, that's run Michigan, run by Michigan State. So that was established in 1980 by the National Science Foundation, and that body of knowledge has been building up on all these different ecosystems in the United States, including Puerto Rico. So here it is, sitting up there quivering. It was put there by ecologists that were trying to understand how the natural world works. All right. Ecologists have had the luxury to determine how the world is, how the world works. They've had the luxury to be descriptive. Agriculturists have not been so fortunate. They've had the burden to be prescriptive. And those are two cultures. I didn't appreciate to what extent they are two cultures. But if you are stuck with the annual, you're involved in a Sisyphus effort. But now with the perennials on the horizon, we can imagine that it's like changing the hardware. We now have different hardware to work with. And so that it's now going to be easier to bring those processes of the wild to the farm. The last Green Revolution was predicated on bushels and acres. The last Green Revolution was fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation wells, and it led to an awful lot of social injustice. A sustainable Green Revolution has to take into account the social justice issues. I think that we can say that if a farmer does not have to borrow money, have credit, in order to buy the inputs, then he or she is not at risk when there's a crop failure. We had a lot of that in the last Green Revolution. Yes, we increased the yields 2.5 to 3-fold, but we did it with the industrial mind. So ecology, it seems to me, has the potential. Just as the Copernican revolution changed our idea of where we are in the universe. The sun doesn't go around the earth. The earth goes around the sun. That had a great philosophical impact on us. In a similar manner, to move from the industrial mind, which has given us all sorts of brain damage. That is, it's given us this awful fundamentalism called technological fundamentalism. The belief that we're going to solve our problems through technology rather than to think about the necessity of limits. And this, I think, will help us appreciate that the scaffolding of civilization that is standing behind all of these efficiencies is unacknowledged fossil fuel dependency. And I'll tell you, let me elaborate here. For 10 years, we had a 10-year Sunshine Farm study. Marty Bender directed it. It was a total of 210 acres, 50 acres of crops, 160 of forage. We had photovoltaic panels that provided all the electricity for the place. We had a biodiesel tractor. We grew the fuel for the biodiesel tractor. We had chickens for eggs and for meat. We had draft animals. We were able to do something of a comparison between the draft animal and the biodiesel tractor. Marty went all the way back to the energy costs for mining the ore in the Minnesota Iron Range to build the tractor, to processing in Gary, Indiana, to assembly, the 30 worker days for assembly, the 6.2 a mile one day average commute, and on and on. And including a bolt. If a bolt, we went to town to get a bolt, then he weighed the bolt and got the embodied energy of the bolt. So, and the trip to town and amortizing the pickup truck, it's a horrendous hunk of data. Well, I said to Marty, one day I said, look, Marty, we got to know, what are these other people where you're getting some of this data, where do they quit in getting at the energy costs? Should we be charging any of the blacktop put on the road to the farm? Well, how in the hell are we going to do that? So, okay, Marty, well, what do we charge? Where do we stop? Where do they stop? He threw his pencil down. He says, when they get tired. You can't get at all of that. But what you can begin to appreciate is once you start at it, you realize the skyscrapers, the board meetings, the flights, making decisions about everything from a neoprene washer to whether it's going to be made in China. You see? So that scaffolding of civilization is somehow opaque to us. So here's what I'm saying, that if we begin to get an ecological worldview, we will be able to come to terms with limits faster than we ever could, so long as we have this strong dependency on fossil fuels. I hope you don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say when I tell you this next little tidbit. Robert Louis Stevenson came across the country and he went to, I don't know, Tahiti or one of those islands in the Pacific. And he noted that they practiced infanticide, but they never spanked their kids. He had come from Scotland, where they beat the hell out of their kids, but they never practiced infanticide. Now, they knew they had so much land. They knew how far out they could go to fish and still get back. So they acknowledged limits. We got a big continent. And Dan Luton at Berkeley said something to me coming across the Bay Bridge once. He and I were both on the board of Friends of the Earth. And he said, he actually published this also, but he said, you know, Wes, our problem is we came as a poor people to a seemingly empty land that was rich in resources. And we built our institutions for that perception of reality. Our political institutions, our economic institutions, and our educational institutions, and even our religious institutions, predicated on poor people, empty land, rich. Well, now we've become rich people in an increasingly poor land that's filling up. And those institutions don't hold. We patch them up, we give them a lick and a promise, but they don't hold. So if we're to have this cultural transformation that is necessary, I think it begins with agriculture, and it begins right where the break began, where the split began. And so this is more than about that, because if we can imagine, say, what are the true economies? They're rainforests, they're alpine meadows, they're prairies. They feature material recycling, and they run on contemporary sunlight. They are obeying the second law of thermodynamics at various levels, at various trophic levels. If we can build an agriculture that is somewhat isomorphic with that, we can then begin to have a different set of metaphors for human economies generally. And then we may have a chance. If we can keep our soils, we can get through this long, dark tunnel in which we have the need to decrease population and reduce economic growth. And as T.S. Eliot, it's the fourth quartet of Little Gidding, the poet T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration. And in the end, we'll know the place for the first time. The discovery of the earth is still before us. So far, we've only exploited it. I thank you.